So this is kind of a strange little angle that I found. I think this area here doesn't really look like Singapore. And I thought at first maybe it's just like the state of these buildings. I mean, frankly, the ones that are taller are kind of fine. This one in the middle is a bit. It's not in great shape, but it's not dilapidated either. But I think it's the combination of like this overgrown-ish looking plants plus all the other stuff that makes it kind of not feel like Singapore, because I think Singapore tends to be a lot more manicured, a lot more maintained, a lot more put together. And I think that's the image that even us Singaporeans get, I guess, lured into thinking. It's not that we don't know that there are other parts of Singapore, I guess. It's just that the sanitized version is kind of the more easily recalled, palatable version of Singapore. And sometimes I feel like why I love Singapore so much, weird as it is, it's kind of related to how many similarities I have within myself that is echoed in Singapore's story. And I've never really considered myself patriotic, really. I don't know why this topic is turning out into this, but anyway, I guess what I mean to say is I don't really think of myself as somebody who like loves my country necessarily. Maybe because it's not a very common attitude to have here in Singapore, but in fact it's kind of seen as like a bit like, oh, you're kind of lame for expressing that you like Singapore. Like it's kind of uncool to like your own country. But I think for me, I don't really think of loving Singapore in that way. Like the only reason why I've come to realize that I do like Singapore and that I even love Singapore is really the idea that when I think about where I want to be, where I want to live, I can't imagine staying long term in any other place besides Singapore, and that's kind of how I know it is the place for me. Which is not to say it doesn't have its ups and downs, but like you gotta accept the good and the bad together. So sometimes I think about the story of Singapore and also I guess how I've come about. And I think a lot of who I am is really shaped by the fact that I have grown up in this cultural, societal context. And so much of its stories, so many of its, I won't say repressed, but maybe just, not brought to the surface, unresolved, unprocessed things that Singapore as a country has in its history, in its story, kind of get reflected inside my own personal story. So I think this whole like sanitized versus, the fact that there are actually wild areas in Singapore. I mean, granted, for some people this might not be very wild, but for Singapore this is kind of like odd. And that again comes to this idea of like, what is our barometer of normal? And I think Singapore's barometer of normal and what things should be, how things should be, is kind of skewed. I would say generally the standard of living, the quality of life, the material goods, a lot of the measurable things that you can measure are all pretty good, but somehow we're not particularly happy as a group of people. And I wonder whether part of it is just that we don't realize that these things are good because to us they're normal. We don't realize that if you don't upkeep your buildings, they kind of deteriorate because most of us live in public housing and the upkeep is done by the town council, and we don't really pay as much as people living in private condos do. So you don't really think about the fact that when you have a physical building, you need to upkeep not just the inside of the house but also the outside. Which is very different than if you live in like a landed property, which in Singapore is like, maybe you have a semi-detached 2-story home, 1-story home with some land around it. And then that's when you have to start thinking, oh, now I have to figure out who do I call to maintain, I don't know, my pipes, my roofing, the moss that grows outside on the facade of my house, because Singapore is wet and humid and a tropical country. Yeah, there's a lot of things that I think we take for granted. And as much as I recognize that for Singapore as a country, I recognize that for myself as well. I know I have a lot of privilege and advantages that to me is normal because that's kind of how I've lived my life. And I know that there are things that people would want that I have. And sometimes I wonder, am I not feeling grateful enough for all these advantages that I have? But I think the other thing that comes with it is, with the ups comes the downs. I mean, with the upsides comes the downsides. And like, Singapore got to where it is because of a lot of decisions that have been made. In hindsight, you might think, of course it makes sense, but I think in the presence of making them, they would have been relatively risky, relatively uncertain, relatively tough decisions to have made, including things like our independence, amongst others. Yeah. And I guess I forgot where I was going with this. But like, I think sometimes I don't know whether I want to comment about Singapore as a country or whether I want to comment about my personal life. But any fault of Singapore that I point out is probably a fault that I do have as well. So it's not like I'm just pointing fingers and being like, haha, look at this. And I think that's the tough part. Like I'm not here to nitpick for the sake of nitpicking. I know one of the things about Singaporeans is that complaining is a pastime. Well, honestly, I don't like that. I don't like when people complain for the sake of complaining. I'm not saying that every complaint needs to have a resolution necessarily, because I think I do agree that there are some things that you can't just fix quickly or easily. But I think after a certain point, complaining for the sake of complaining just becomes counterproductive and doesn't really do much besides vent off a bit of a frustration and then like afterwards maybe make you feel a bit bad. I don't know. I'm not in a very good expressive mood today, but I've just had a lot of thoughts on my mind lately, and like I said in the previous video, I don't feel ready to share a lot of it. So now we have this somewhat other not well thought through thoughts coming out. But it's fine. It's fine. Yeah. So Singapore, I would say I think it's less about whether Singapore has advantages or no advantages, or Singapore exists in a weird place where it can have a superiority complex, because it's like, as a country we did so much within the last how many years to get to where we are, the story of like from third to first world country. But at the same time, there is an inferiority complex, and actually inferiority complex and a superiority complex are two sides of the same coin. They are kind of stemming from the same root cause, which is that there is something that is not fully integrated within the story of ourselves. That then the ego has a need to be like, I am better than other people, or to feel like there is a need to be like, I'm better than others, to protect the fragile inside of that feeling of like, I'm not actually better than others, or the inferiority complex, which is kind of like the less masked truth, which is that, oh, I don't actually feel like I'm that great compared to others. And I think Singapore as a country has that, and I feel like I myself on a personal level have that. Yeah, there are a lot of circumstances, I don't want to talk about them. Gosh, this is a vague AF video, so annoying. I'm not a fan of when people start telling stuff and they're like, there's this thing, but I can't tell you much of the details because I need to protect certain privacy. It's like, just tell me, or don't tell me at all. I don't know. Anyway, I feel like anything else I say would be in the same vague vein, so I'm just gonna end this off here. Yeah, I'm not gonna go into another tangent. Alright, that's all, bye.